This is a special production of ABC News.
For over 200 years, Americans have chosen leaders with an astonishing variety of personal style. We've picked the educated and the rough and ready, the wealthy and the self-made man. Some were eager to lead. Others forced themselves out of a sense of obligation. A few were truly beloved. Others lost their connection to us. And some still remain an enigma. But how well do we really understand the minds and hearts of these men who, for a brief time in history, we called Mr. President? Witnessed a reenactment of George Washington's inauguration. It was on this spot, 200 years earlier, that presidential style was born.
I do solemnly swear that I will execute the office of the President.
And while all presidents, from George Washington
and will, to the best of
to
my
George
ability,
Bush, pledged the same oath, each has left behind his own unique legacy of style.
protect and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
The way a president walks and talks, works and plays, deals with the press and mixes with the public are all part of his personal style. And in the age of television, we often get a close-up and unadorned view. With the rapid advance of communications in the last 30 years, we've become much more aware of presidential style. Our presidents, once safe behind the White House doors, have come under the ever-increasing scrutiny of the public. No longer the remote, elevated figures of the past, we tend to see them more as human beings, with human problems. In recent years, presidents have been made and broken. These days, presidential hopefuls are trained in media style, for they know that in the world of the 30-second soundbite, the way you say something is almost as important as what you say. Of course, presidential style didn't begin with television. George Washington's style would set standards for all future presidents. His was one of great dignity. And though he was described as little short of divine, Washington was careful not to appear too much like a king. Some wanted to call him His Excellency, but Washington insisted on the less regal Mr. President. You might have thought that the stately George Washington would have played well on television, but according to Doris Goodwin, a political analyst and historian, he would have had one big problem.
The problem for George Washington today would obviously be every time he sat in one of those debate platforms and tried to smile to look pleasant, those ill-fitting wooden teeth would have probably popped around a little bit, making his smile less than pleasant.
Washington, though accused by some of being stuffy, had a natural presence that demanded respect. He would be a hard act to follow. John Adams admitted as much. No one questioned the second president's competence. Adams himself once said,
"I am obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular."
There would be more like him. But the third president was a different breed. Thomas Jefferson brought a new sense of informality to the White House. He even greeted foreign diplomats in his slippers. A musician, architect, writer, and inventor, it seemed he could do anything.
High, squeaky voice that even he decided that he wouldn't speak in person before the Congress after a while because he knew it was such a weakness that he had.
James Madison was so short he was almost a dwarf. Always wearing black, he was once described as a schoolmaster dressed for a funeral. But what James lacked in style, her skilled hospitality smoothed many a quarrel for the president. James Monroe was the last of the Revolutionary Fathers. With his ancient attire and courtly manner, he seemed a relic from the past. A visitor once described him this way:
Balding, watery-eyed, and ink-stained.
They called John Quincy his one indulgence, swimming nude in the Potomac River. Compared to the prim and proper Adams, Andrew Jackson was crude and boisterous. His inauguration was more like a barroom brawl than a presidential ceremony. And while intellectuals called him a barbarian, he was loved by the common man. Not so with Martin Van Buren. If you had lived at the time and couldn't make up your mind, you'd have been accused of Van Burenism. And while some speaking, on his wintry inauguration day, he droned on later. That made John Tyler the first vice president to take the presidency upon the death of an incumbent. Tyler younger than he. Next was James Polk, a cold, formal president with a highly suspicious nature. A contemporary of Polk put it this way:
The man drinks too much water.
Old Zach Taylor, the unpretentious, sure-shot tobacco spitter, was the polar opposite of Polk. Loved by the people as a hero of the Mexican War, old Zach had simple tastes and a courteous, soft-spoken manner. Taylor, and above all, hopelessly mediocre. But his wife did install the first bathtub in the White House. Franklin Pierce was a charmer, but his presidency was marked. Refrained from using the Bible at his inauguration, choosing instead James Buchanan, and obsessed with precision, he once refused a check for $15,000 because it was off by 10 cents. Abraham Lincoln was a deep and serious thinker, but he was also one of the greatest storytellers in American history. The press didn't always like it, but Lincoln used anecdotes and humor to make points and respond to criticism. Accused once of being two-faced, Lincoln responded,
I leave it to you. If I had two faces, do you think I'd be walking around with this one?
Today, we honor Lincoln as an inspired leader, and we remember him as a spellbinding speaker. But how would Lincoln have done in the age of television?
As historians have described him, he was so grotesquely ugly that he almost was handsome. He had a voice that was so high-pitched that people say it sounded like the whine of a wild dog. He had a frontier lingo that said there and here and thar instead of what we normally jabbing his finger every time he spoke. If we didn't know him, I think would make it very hard for us to develop an initial attachment to this tall, bearded, very difficult-speaking man.
Andrew Johnson, a tailor by trade, was the only president to make his own clothes. Indecisive and paranoid, Johnson blundered through his 4 years in office. Ulysses S. Grant may be the original Teflon president. Though his administration was fraught with scandal, the mild-mannered Civil War general was a popular folk hero throughout his life. When Rutherford B. Hayes was president, it was prayer in the morning, religious hymns at night, and never, ever any tobacco or liquor in the White House. A glum guest at a White House dinner observed,
The water flowed like champagne.
The next president, James Garfield, tried to please everyone, but found he couldn't. He was killed by a disgruntled man who wanted a job in the State Department and didn't get it. They called Chester Arthur the Prince of Hospitality. Fine food, drink, and social gatherings were his strength. Work was his weakness. They say Chester Arthur never did today what he could put off till tomorrow. In contrast, the short, stubby Grover Cleveland was a workaholic. But he was also a huge eater who traveled with a fast crowd. And though he kept it from the public, he fathered and elected to 2 non-consecutive terms. The man in between was Benjamin Harrison, the grandson of William Henry Harrison. Ben was calm and dignified as a public speaker, but on a one-to-one basis, he was a cold fish. William McKinley was just the opposite. He had a memory for faces and a personal style that turned enemies into friends. Famous for his warm handshake, he was ironically assassinated while shaking hands with a crowd of voters in Buffalo. That opened up the presidency to a totally new phenomenon by the name of Theodore Roosevelt. A man of energy and action, Roosevelt's American War. This president loved a good fight, and he used his bully pulpit to attack the rich trust companies, which he called malefactors of great wealth. A champion of the common man, Roosevelt became the most popular president in history. His inaugural was the first to be so fair. Perhaps no president, before or since, has filled the presidency with as much vitality. Certainly not his successor, William H. Taft. Taft couldn't remember names and fell asleep during meetings. At 350 pounds, he had to have a special bathtub constructed in the White House. Woodrow Wilson believed he was predestined to be president, and his sacred mission to bring peace to the world. Cameras followed Wilson to Paris in 1918, where he negotiated the Treaty of Versailles. Though everyone was glad to see the war end, the somber Wilson left people cold. His handshake was later described as a 10-cent pickle wrapped in a brown paper bag. Warren Harding was possibly the worst public speaker ever to hold office. The former newspaperman insisted on writing his own speeches, even though he had no sense of style or grammar. Progression, he once said, is not proclamation nor palaver. It is not of personal pronouns nor perennial pronouncement. But at least Harding was trying. Calvin Coolidge was virtually inactive. They say he slept 11 hours a day, and when he died, writer Dorothy Parker quipped, "How can they tell?" Herbert Hoover presided over the Depression and didn't cheer anybody up with his hopeful claims that prosperity is right around the corner. The next president took a different approach.
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the first real media president. His personal strength and warmth came through in his radio fireside chats and guided a frightened nation through the Depression and World War II.
I cite as another example a statement made on Sunday night that a Japanese carrier had been located and sunk.
Roosevelt also appeared regularly in newsreels where his personal style could be seen as well as heard. Even severe personalities like Joseph Stalin eventually relaxed around him. Roosevelt, a victim of polio, spent much of his presidency in leg braces and a wheelchair, although he never allowed reporters to photograph him that way. He rarely spoke of his condition, but he did so in this newsreel.
I hope that you will pardon me for an unusual posture of sitting down, but I know that you will realize that it makes it a lot easier for me in not having to carry about 10 pounds of steel round on the bottom of my legs.
FDR was the only president elected 4 times. Some say he's the closest we've ever come to having a king. Compared to FDR, Harry Truman seemed like the guy next door. The feisty Midwesterner and former clothier was one of the sharpest dressers in presidential history. But in the election of 1948, he was the underdog. The press predicted he'd be beaten by his rival, Thomas Dewey. But the underdog turned out to be a bulldog.
It was 11 o'clock the next morning before Dewey conceded, and later the president attended a victory dinner. He mimicked a radio commentator and he brought down the House.
And we are very sure that when the country vote comes in, Mr. Truman will be defeated by an overwhelming majority.
Harry Truman proved to be a decisive, straightforward president, handling the
Say the lies.
I for president, I for president, I for president, I for president. You like I do, I like I do. Everybody likes I for president.
With war hero status, they said no one could have beaten Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1952. The amiable, easygoing Ike had a contagious smile and was the first president to campaign on his, well, likability.
You like I do, I like I do. Everybody likes I for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum. We'll take Ike to Washington.
But Ike proved to be a somewhat aloof president, with an indirect leadership style that some said made him invisible. Presidential style took a new turn in 1960, with the arrival of Senator John Fitzgerald Kennedy from Massachusetts. Together with his beautiful wife Jacqueline, Kennedy offered America a new sense of possibility and youthful determination.
That I will be worthy of your trust, who will carry the fight to the people in the fall, and we shall win.
He would be helped by the new medium of television, which was perfectly suited to Kennedy's calm, confident style. In a series of nationally televised debates, his poise and intelligent tone seemed to outclass his nervous opponent, Richard Nixon.
as the Gallup poll showed, is because the Soviet Union made a breakthrough in outer space. Mr. George Allen, head of your information service, has said that that made the people of the world begin to wonder whether we were first in science. We're first in other areas of science, but in space, which is the new science, we're not first.
Kennedy didn't win the election by much, and he knew that to be successful as president, he'd have to increase his popular support. The key would be visibility, and he'd start by showing off his family.
Every degree of mind and spirit that I possess will be devoted to the long-range interests of the United States and to the cause of freedom around the world. So now my wife and I prepare for a new administration and for a new baby. Thank you.
America's new first family seemed the stuff of storybook dreams, attractive, wealthy, and at the pinnacle of physical and political power. For a brief time, they were America's own royal family. Kennedy closely guarded this image as a devoted family man, and only after his death would stories about marital difficulties between the president and his wife begin to emerge. Another image projected by JFK was one of physical vitality and vigor. Although sickly since childhood and hampered by a bad back, Kennedy looked the part of a healthy, robust sportsman, and this gave him a fresh appeal. He also had a strong speaking style, which could at times be inspiring.
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans.
His inaugural speech is hailed as one of the greatest in history. In it, Kennedy borrowed a line from one of our poorest presidential speakers, Warren Harding, proving that the way you say something can make all the difference.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
At 43, Kennedy was the youngest elected president in history and the first to be born in the 20th century. He wanted to prove that he wasn't an inexperienced lightweight, and his solution was, again, visibility. He was the first president to hold live, nationally televised news conferences.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Where he quickly demonstrated a firm grasp of the issues.
Good afternoon. Won't you be seated?
Flights of American aircraft penetrating the airspace of the Soviet Union have been suspended since May 1960. I have ordered that they not be resumed.
Polls soon showed a 91% approval rating of Kennedy's television style. His strategy of being a highly visible, involved president was working.
Newspaper reports, and I feel there would be more...
Kennedy traveled extensively throughout the United States, and wherever he went, he charmed. To the dismay of his Secret Service people, he liked to get close to the public, where he could be seen and touched. They say that up close, he radiated a kind of life force that stirred hope in people. Though scholarly at times, Kennedy was never stuffy. In fact, he liked nothing better than to poke fun at rituals, and he did so with a great sense of wit. Like the time he, a Harvard man, was to receive an honorary degree from his rival school, Yale.
It might be said now that I have the best of both worlds, a Harvard education and a Yale degree.